again. I'm Dave Thompson, and I've been fishing this lake since they impounded it back in 1975. I've done a lot of fishing here, done a lot of fishing over at Black Hills. I spent a lot of time in the 70s over at Tridelphia and Rocky Gorge. Real familiar with those. Anybody here fish Rocky Gorge? Okay, Tridelphia. Did you also happen to fish over at Black Hill? What jumps out of you is like immediately the difference between those two bodies of water? Anything like weeds? Yep. Weeds, yeah. The thing about a weedy lake is it's going to support a lot more bass. I was back on Rocky Gorge a lot this spring because I knew where the fish were going to be. But that's the kind of lake where when you don't know exactly where they'll be, there's a lot of water out there, and the bass populations are smaller and they have a tendency to move around. So, at any rate, I really got my start bass fishing, a long time ago with my brothers. We were fishing ponds, putting plastic worms between lily pads, and I think my brother, we were catching probably 10, 12-inch bass, and all of a sudden my brother pulled in a 3-pounder, and that just kind of like got the early spark for me. It's my favorite fish to fish for. So I was in a lot of different types of boats back in those days, some rowboats, some stuffs with electric motors. I got into college and everything, got away from this area for a little bit, and came back, and it was 1991, and I was really in the Hudson Trail Outfitters on Rockville Pike when they had one in Gaithersburg. I was really thinking I was looking for a canoe, because kayak fishing, not a lot of chatter about it back in those days. So I go in there, but there's a 10-foot sit inside kayak, and it just kind of made sense to me. It's like, I'm going to be pointing in this direction. I've got the paddle right in front of me. I'm not going to be setting a paddle down like I would in a canoe. It just seemed to make sense. Like, that looks like a pretty good fishing platform. It'll fit right into the bed of my pickup truck. So 15 minutes later, it was in the bed of my pickup truck, and I was off and fishing. I fished out of sit-inside kayaks for over 10 years, largely because that was, again, what was available at the time. Wasn't that familiar with the sit on top, which I really like right now. I kind of transferred over. I had a Tarpon 100. That was the first sit on top kayak that I got. I really like that for fishing on the Potomac River, because the ability to sit in your kayak and drop a leg over to just give yourself a quick anchor, something that I really couldn't do inside my sit-inside kayak. And I have a little bit of a football injury, lower back, and I found the sit on top, the ability to move around, I was a lot more comfortable and being able to spend more time on the water. Then I guess there was a Chad Hoover video from Kayak Bass Fishing where all of a sudden the Ride 115 was introduced, and I'm like, it's only a matter of time before that kayak went something like the ability to be able to stand, make a longer cast, or maybe see down into those laydowns. So I went into a Hudson Trail Outfitter, and this guy was sitting right there in camo, and I'm like, okay, I'm not getting out of here without another kayak. So I think in that one, 30 minutes later, I was standing in the Potomac River, paddling it around. So that's the kayak that I'm with right now. Largemouth bass, they're pretty aggressive fish. Has anybody ever had one in a tank before? A fish tank? You seen one? I've had one. You had?
Yeah.
Okay. You drop the food in there, and they're on it generally like that. Once they get used to the tank and everything, it's a wonder we have such a hard time catching them sometimes. It's like they, very aggressive fish, very opportunistic fish. I remember one time I tied a new lure on in front of the tank, and I was just kind of bouncing it in front of the bass, thinking, what do you think? But what he thought is he came out of the tank to try to get it, jumped out onto the floor, so I had to retrieve him, put him back in there. So it's like, very aggressive fish. Again, opportunistic feeder. When they're out here chasing bluegills or crappies or yellow perch, if they get one that they're able to get, they don't care. They'll take any of them. Trout is an example of a fish that feeds differently. They will sit in a feeding station in a stream, and they can get very focused on a particular stage of a hatch of a fly, and they're just going to sit at that feeding station and sip that thing over and over again. And trout fishermen find, I need to find what stage of the fly they're biting, and you need to try to match that hatch to make those catches. Largemouth bass, again, you get the right thing in front of them at the right time and they'll take it. Ural largemouth bass. I'm primarily going to talk about fishing for them in the fall, but one of the things that's different about the fall is, let me start with what it's like in the summertime. Guys, have you ever heard of the thermocline before? Okay. The thermocline, it's still there. I'm wondering with this wind today if it's actually going to start to turn over. But thermocline here is down at about 18 feet. Over at Black Hills, it's at about 22, 23 feet. And you will know this, like, you're not going to find fish below that thermocline. What happens there is we've got the warmer surface water that gets cycled by the wind, so the oxygen content is fairly high, and then we get a layer of water where the temperature rapidly changes down to the deeper depths, and a lot of things go down there and begin to decay that will take the oxygen out of the water. So down below that thermocline, you're generally not going to find any fish. I have an AquaView camera, which is you've got a little CRT up in your boat, and you can lower the camera down on a cable, and I've got about 50 feet. When you get the thing down in the middle of the summertime over at Black Hill, down about 40-45 feet, it looks like the surface of the moon. There's a very fine silt on top of there. You can tell that there's not a lot of water circulation. When the camera hits the bottom, you just see it like it'll puff up and then it'll settle back down. Obviously, it just has a situation where the light can't get down to warm that water. That water probably stays at a fairly constant temperature all through the summertime, and so it does kind of focus our bass. We're going to be looking for them, where's the thermocline, and I find frequently that the bigger bass will be just above that thermocline where the light penetration is to their liking, the dissolved oxygen content is to their liking, and they'll move up on major points and find a little bit of cover down around that depth. So you target a lot of bigger bass there. In the fall, and the difference that we get here is I'll be fishing those deep points, chasing bass down 18-20 feet deep, and all of a sudden in the middle of September, the water temperature hasn't changed, but all of a sudden the fish are gone from those spots. And generally what happens is they've pushed up into the shallower weeds, and they're starting to feel that urgency. The fall, they know they need to feed up for the winter time, so they're going to be up into those weeds, looking for little bluegills, looking for yellow perch, anything that they can feed on. In the middle of the fall, we can get the situation that like I said, I think may be occurring now, is we're going to get what they call turnover, and that's when that top layer and the bottom layer are about the same temperature, and then we get a lot of wind, so that thermocline begins to break up, and the circulation for the whole lake begins. It goes down below. You get a lot of wind. It'll just move that stuff up. I'll notice, so like over at Black Hill, I'll suddenly look at the water and it'll look chalky. It's like you're in the middle of the turnover there. Supposedly, what I read is fishing's not supposed to be good during the turnover. What I usually do is I just push to the shoreline when I see it start to happen, and you'll still find fish. Maybe push up into where some different water is coming in from a feeder creek. It'll give them an area where the bait fish may begin to concentrate. A good place to look for them. Right after the turnover is done and settled down, all of a sudden you'll start to notice the water gets like extremely clear. I think what happens is the plankton is no longer being produced because we don't have as much sunlight during the day, so the water loses that green color, and all of a sudden you can start to see straight down there, so you're on the other side of a turnover. The cooler nights begin to cool the shallows, and as the weeds die, the bass will begin to pull out of that area, that shallow area where they were feeding so heavily before. And I was out here last December. I spent the first part of the day, I was convinced that they were going to still be holding on the wood or the remaining weeds that were there, because that area might hold some residual heat. Worked my way all the way around the lake. Like got a couple of like little small taps. Hadn't hooked anything. Came over a hard bottom area there, cruising over, and all of a sudden I started seeing fish on my fish finder at about 15 to 20 feet deep. And I'm like, well, you know, I banged the jig down that incline down towards me, and the bass, about 21 inches, real thick back, you know, had popped that jig. He was beginning to move, you know, they were beginning to move in towards their winter holding place, because we had such a brutal winter. They did go all the way down into the deepest basin. We actually filmed something for Jeff's channel. I think it was probably 2 or 3 weeks later, and instead of the fish being at 20 feet, we were finding them more like all the way down to 30 feet. That was just how it worked out last winter. Let's see, 3 winters ago, we had a very mild winter. Water is at its most dense at 39 degrees, so that water is going to sink down. We had a surface layer that was probably 40 to 43 degrees. Even all winter long, you could probably always find water here that was 40 degrees. Those bass were in that top layer, so I was able to fish for them through the winter that way. Let me talk about some of the things that I like to use this time of year. Now, my strategy in the summertime is a lot of times is to basically just camp out on a big structural element. And I know at some point bigger bass are going to move in to want to feed in that area. That's not such a good strategy this time of year. I think you're better off getting out there with a spinner bait or a crankbait and starting to look for fish. Once you find a few fish, you can do some different things to try to target them. This first crankbait that I'm going to show everybody, fat-free shad, goes through the water with a lot of water displacement. Good summertime crankbait. Good early fall crankbait when they're still very aggressive. That one will probably dive 6 to 8 feet. The next thing is the Rapala DT series. This is a DT6, and this has a little bit tighter wiggle. Doesn't quite, whereas the other one will come through the water. This one's getting a little bit tighter. So you're looking for lures that you can kind of match the activity level with the bass. So this would be like an intermediate one. And as it progresses cooler and cooler, almost all the way into the winter, something like a Rapala shad wrap, which is a very, very subtle wiggle, very thin crankbait, that becomes a much better thing. Crankbaits are great for figuring out where the bass are. I was on Black Hill 2 weeks ago, and I suspected that the bass were probably going to be over the deep weed beds, and what I did is I slow rolled a spinnerbait over the top of those weed beds. I was just trying to tick the top of the weeds. Picked up a few fish, and then I would work the deeper edge with a jig to see if there were any bigger fish around. Didn't really have any success with bigger fish, but I caught a lot of the 12 to 15 inch size. The lipless crankbaits are always good this time of year. Those you can fish right over the top of the weeds. If you feel it, the treble start to contact the top of the weeds, you can rip that out of there, and you can get the fish to react when they're in the mood to chase. Spinner bait in here somewhere. I think I do. Well, I know what I need to do. I need to give some of these goodies away. There's some spinner bait. One of my favorite soft plastics. One for you. One for you. I use these a lot as jig trailers. Jeff also caught like a 30-inch snakehead on one of these, fishing it on one of his dragging heads.
Thank you.
There you go. of those. Let me get one of those. Everybody get one? Everybody get one? Okay. Thank you. The type of spinnerbait that I was having a lot of success here, because I pre-fished out here last weekend, was this. This is a 3/8 ounce spinnerbait, double willow in Tennessee shad. That's an example. What I was having success was is the way the weeds are piling up. We get some mats that are forming out here, and I was just running along the edge, and the bass were coming out and taking a shot at something like that. The one way, if you like to throw spinner baits, and I think 3 seasons ago I was like a spinnerbait fanatic, and I was trying to find a way to extend the spinnerbait into the fall as the water cooled down. Is I'll take a spinnerbait like that, I'll cut the leading blade off, just leave the back one, and you can start to fish it like a jig. You can take something like that, and I'll do it over here, so I don't bring back 10 pounds of weeds, but I'll let it hit the bottom, and then I'll lift and then let it drop again. You know, right now you can probably still get away with burning that thing, either right along the surface when the wind's blowing, and they'll come after that, or you can do, you know, like let it retrieve it, what they call, where you can just still begin to see it as it's coming through the water column and just kind of roll to there. Spinnerbaits are great. I mean, you can get heavier ones and slow roll them over the deep weeds. It works particularly effective, you know, because the crankbaits in 6 to 8 feet of water out here are probably, those troubles are going to get down into that hydrilla, and you're going to get a wad of that stuff every time you try to bring them back. But this, you know, you can work it over the top. Because the hook's riding up, you're not going to get so badly snug up. But again, it's like later in the thing, you can lift and just let it flutter down. And the reason I was cutting that blade off is, and just leave, I'll just take that off and just leave that one, is when I pick it up, that blade will get moving like right away. If you leave both blades on in that kind of situation, you'll get tangled and you won't get that immediate activity. And I also think they helicopter down to the bottom better that way. And if they start to drop, that thing will trail behind it, and then you're just looking to feel the pop or your line moving left and right, and you know somebody approved of your presentation. So now these guys like to fish generally with like their kayaks bristling with rods. I don't. A lot of times I put a spinning rod in here, so if people ask me how come I don't have a spinning rod with me, because I don't fish with a lot. I just have a tendency to fish with, you know, this just works for me, and everybody has to find, you know, what works for them. Is I basically have 2 identical bait casting rod and reels right there. What I'm looking for is that feel, particularly with my favorite thing to fish with, which is jigs. I want to have that same feel when I move from rod to rod or from lure to lure. I want to know when somebody's picked up my presentation. I found I had a mishmash of like different types of rods and reels, and I felt like I was losing some of that sensitivity that I feel like I need to have when I'm out there chasing the bass. So that's what works for me. The other thing that works for me is it produced a couple of really nice fish for me on the Rocky Gorge. Is some of the overhanging trees. Both my rods wind up, you know, sitting on my lap like that. I'm coming underneath there. You know, I can go right underneath those overhanging trees where the bass are looking to hide back under an area like that where they're not, you know, they're safe from overhead attack. So not, you know, I'm not getting hung up on anything. It's the other reason why I have my transducer right now is actually through my scupper hole into the bottom. The shape of the ride somewhat protected. If you look at the bottom of the hull, it's like that, so it's up at the top. So I get a little nervous. We were out on the Susquehanna River a couple weeks ago, maybe a month ago, something like that. Get a little nervous right there because it feels like my transducer could impact a rock at any moment. But if I'm on tidal Potomac, I don't even think about it, or here, I don't think about it at all. And I don't have a transducer arm. It's like dragging, you know, picking up a lot of weeds, getting in my way, any possibility like that. So let's see, what else did I want to talk about? You have any questions about anything I've like been going over with the presentations? Anybody have a favorite presentation this time of year for the fall? No?
I have a question.
Sure.
Just about like rod and tackle management. So do you use any type of like leashes or floats on your rigs?
Now I probably should. I lost a rod just on the other side of this building, and water so shallow I could not believe it. And I was getting so frustrated, but I launched and I felt it, heard it splash behind me. And I'm like, oh, it's in such shallow water, I'll find it. I could not get it. It just disappeared into those weeds, never to be seen again. The thing is that after you've been like dragging a lure for about 15 minutes, I probably should have like tried to mark the spot, but I was for sure I was going to get that thing back. I know a lot of guys will put that rod float in the area right in front of here, and I haven't heard any complaints. Has anybody got that kind? Let's see. Leashes. Some people will put a leash on their rod behind them or something like that. I just know a river guy who says, yeah, he's not big on a lot of extra cords or anything hanging around that might get him. Although he probably wouldn't approve of, you know, my line running down here from my anchor either. So that's what I do. As the season progresses out here, ultimately what starts to happen is you're trending towards suspending jerk baits. I don't know if anybody's familiar with those. Lucky Craft Pointers Rapala X Wraps. That's a lure, you know, you'll cast it out, you'll sweep it down, it'll get 3 or 4 feet under the surface, and you stop it, and it basically neutrally buoyant. It'll sit right in that part of the water column. It doesn't sink, or actually, I'm sorry, it doesn't rise, or it doesn't sink. They may move a little bit depending on the water temperature, but Lucky Crafts in particular are really good about suspending, and it's another lure you can use to get the feel for how fast, you know, how active the bass are. You can throw that thing out there, and sometimes you want to dead stick it for just, you know, 1, 2, 3, bump it again, 1, 2, 3, bump it again. That'll work. As it gets colder and colder, you can almost like chuck it out there, swing it down, let it sit right there for 30 seconds, you know, bump it forward, let it 30 seconds. The bass, they just don't move that fast. If something looks like it's going to be hard for them to catch in the colder water, they don't have the metabolism to try to run it down. They're just going to let that thing get away. I didn't get one this year, but I was trying to catch a bass here on New Year's Day. The mild winter a few years ago, I got one on New Year's Day on a jig, small jig on the bottom. The following year, I got one on a suspending jerkbait on that point that's on the other side of the lake over by that cove over there. You know, I was pushed up against the shoreline, and I was just sweeping that thing down. And I think I was actually kind of like looking around at the birds or something like that. All of a sudden, bam! You know, I don't know how long I had left that thing set there, but probably at least 45 seconds before that fish decided that, you know, okay, I can catch this one. Even though I think the water was probably 39 degrees at the time. They'll still bite if you know, can match their aggressive level. I did have one over at Little Seneca Lake one time, fishing a suspending jerkbait right in front of me, and I pulled it in front of me and just stopped it, and very slowly a largemouth was following the exact same trail as the jerkbait, and I'm just watching this fish swim very slowly in front of me, walk up, come right up on the jerkbait, grabbing his mouth. You know, I over there one year when the water was still very cold, I had one come after a spinnerbait 3 times, but he just couldn't manage it. The water was that cold. He's just like, it was a big heavy spinnerbait, and he'd follow it, try to get it, but I couldn't move it slow enough for him to catch up to it. So I said, all right, next time he comes up, I'll just kill it. I'll just kill the retrieve when I see him come and follow it. So I did that, and I killed it, and it just dropped out of sight of him, and the bass just basically sat right there. And that was more than he could deal with. You know, that the lure went down, it got away. It's like, I'm not sorry, I have no more energy to chase right now. The other thing I want to talk about is resources. I think fishing reports have basically disappeared from newspapers. I'm not sure how great the information always was. Anyway, sometimes it was kind of like they're telling you how they were catching them 3 weeks ago, and what I really wanted was what's working right now. Kayak bass fishing, the website was down for a while. It's back up now, and they saved all the information. If you've never been there before, you can sign up for free and get their forum. They got a great search feature where you can see a lot of different rigging ideas. Jeff's got some good stuff up on there about how to rig your kayak. Just about anything you really may want to look into. They've got this. You just use their search feature. Some of you guys are on Snag Line, and probably how you found out about this one going today. That's a great one because, hey, that's really local to us.
What's that one?
It's called Snag Line. Snag Line, and it's mostly Maryland, Virginia, mostly Maryland guys. They cover everything. They'll go from the freshwater, cover the saltwater action. The great thing about them is they have a monthly meet and greet. When they got me onto something that was like I had no idea. Early this year they had a meet and greet. I can't remember which month it was, but we were chasing blue cats at the Woodrow Wilson Bridge with chunks of chicken breast. I caught like 36 blue cats that day on a circle hook. I got fascinated with. I've never really fished a lot with circle hooks, and just got fascinated with like, okay, let me see if I can get it away from him. I mean, if you pull it fast, you don't hook them, but if you do that slow pull with the circle hook, so they introduced me to that fishing, and we caught a bunch in the morning. I tried bass fishing over at the Spoils Cove in the middle of the day, and then I came back and continued to fish until sunset for the blue cats. And as it approached towards sunset, it was drop, and they were on it like instantly. So that's always fun, and I guess apparently those things are there year round, so you can catch them pretty much any time of the year. So that's kayak bass fishing. That's Snag Line. The meet and greets, you'll probably, if you're looking for people to go fishing with, you'll probably find some people that live in your area that you can go fishing with. Got a lot of good tips. What's hot in the area. Let's see. Facebook is a lot of stuff. Once you start, getting to know those people and seeing their Facebook posts. I mean, I got into like Facebook, basically to try to get information about a particular tournament that I was going to go down to in South Carolina, and now I'm in, and most of the people that I, conversing with them, basically, I'm seeing pictures of what they caught that weekend, so. If it's a particularly large fish, they get a PM from me because I want to know where and what they caught it on. Fishing tournaments out of kayaks seem to be, all of a sudden this thing seems to be springing. Brian's involved with something called the MAKBF, and you can get a lot of information from that on Snag Line about where the tournaments are going to be. I guess we had 6 tournaments this year.
We had 5.
We had 5 during the series.
Yeah, we had 4 the first year, and 5 this year.
Gotcha.
And the coming up year, we're going to have 10.
We're going to have 10. Yeah. So, what I like to do, if I do well in one of those tournaments, I like to go back on that site and post what works. I'm not sure some of my competitors share my enthusiasm for sharing some of this information, but anyway, we'll see if we can work on them with that. I really need to see a report from the winner about what worked, what he was throwing, how deep they were, anything else that I can use to help me catch more fish. So that's another avenue to get out with some other fishermen, probably learn some new techniques. I've only been fishing in these tournaments for the past 2 years, and there is something to time management. For me, it's fishing is like, now that I'm very comfortable in my sit on top, it's not uncommon for my pickup truck is bouncing down the road a couple hours before sunrise, and I'm throwing that kayak back into that truck on a Saturday when the sun's going down, when I'm getting kicked off of Little Seneca Lake because they have to be off, so that kind of thing. So I spent a lot of time out on the water. Last couple years, and something else called Kayak Wars has kind of pushed me in this direction where I'm more interested in fishing for trophy bass. And I'll be out on Little Seneca Lake, for instance, sitting there, and I'll be sitting in one spot and I can see 12 bass boats working about that lake. The one thing about that lake over there is it gets a lot of intelligent fishing pressure. So I've kind of gravitated to presentations that have what they call no negative clues. Crankbaits are great for trying to figure out where the bass are. Spinner baits too. Like it's a fairly active retrieve. I think some of the bigger bass, I'm almost positive that they've all been caught on a crankbait or a spinnerbait at some point in their life. As they start to get towards over 20 inches long, I think they just get a little bit more cautious about how they approach certain areas. If they spend a lot of time in shallow water, they're seeing a lot of spinnerbaits rolling over their head, they're seeing a lot of crankbaits over their head. So what I will do is get out there with something like this. This is a black and blue jig that works pretty well in the grass, and I'll be camped out on a major point where I happen to know there's a cover item down there, and I'm just moving that thing across the bottom, literally like that. Works pretty good in the summertime when you know where they're going to be. They have no natural defense over a lure that's moving that slow. They're like, that just looks like something that they can eat, can't get away, it'll be an easy meal, and it has a tendency to appeal to the larger bass. You have to do something when there's a lot of people out there pounding the water with spinnerbaits and crankbaits. So big plastic worms that I throw a lot of those in summertime. As we trend towards winter, I'll start to get into the jigs and everything, but I like it, and at this stage of my fishing career, I don't mind sometimes sacrificing numbers for the quality ones. I guess I'm at that particular stage. I think it's like any fish, many fish, big fish, and maybe hard fish. I'm at that stage where I'm most interested in the biggest passable largemouth that I can get my hands on.